always watch on TV, and they got the big headsets.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't get a big headset here.
Go ahead and put them on.
I like that one. I like that one in the morning with Golick and the other guy.
Oh yeah, Golick and Wingo. Yeah.
I like that one.
That's good. Yeah.
All right, we are live. All right, here we go in 3, 2, 1. What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Sports Medicine Broadcast, a podcast to promote and improve the profession of athletic training. We are talking with Gary Reinl from Mark Pro. Today's show is Stop Using Ice. Right, so we're going to stop using ice as athletic trainers, and Gary's going to tell us why. So just in some of the conversations beforehand, Gary was talking about his background. Gary started out as a gym owner. Gary doesn't have medical credentials, so he's not an athletic trainer, not a physical therapist, not a doctor, anything like that. However, he has trained thousands of athletic trainers, physical therapists, doctors on the benefits of neuromuscular, electrical stimulation, things like that, and lots of different things. He talked about how he created a fitness program for his pregnant wife, and that became a huge hit, and he was an expert in pregnancy fitness. And then he went from there, from owning an Olympic weightlifting gym to training his pregnant wife to training old people, like 90-year-old people. So I think it was like Learn to Walk or something like that. And so he's done everything. And then now Mark Pro, or the anti-ice measures. Also, he had the big dieting thing where he was battling diet companies or diet products and that kind of thing. And so they kind of swallowed him up there. And I'm sure he may mention that. But so he's got a lot of different fingers in the industry of sports medicine, wellness, health. And obviously he is an expert because he'll tell you there. He's got almost all the pro MLB teams working with Mark Pro. And so his product is working, his idea is working, and it's just something that we need to learn more about so we can be more comfortable. So without much further ado, this is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/stop using ice. Again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/stop using ice. I'll have some of the links to the resources that he included in there. And then, so I've got my friend Ray Olivo here with me. Of course, I got Gary Reinl, and John Seco is joining us on the phone all the way from Michigan. If you're watching live on Facebook, we definitely want your questions and your comments. So, Gary, first question I got. I know this is going to be difficult for you. Okay, I'm going to set a timer. 2 minutes or less. 2 minutes or less. Why should we not use ice for injuries? Ready, set, go.
It traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies.
That's it?
That's the reason.
Oh my goodness.
10 seconds or less. That's great.
10 seconds. So every time I've talked to you so far has been, you want the short version or long version. The short version was like 15 minutes. So I was expecting that to cut you off. So, okay. So tell me one more time in the 10-second version then.
Traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. And if you want to take it a little tiny bit further, just a little bit, the doctor who made up the RICE protocol, rest, ice, compression, elevation, the doctor who made that up is Dr. Gabe Merkin, a Harvard-trained doc. He made it up in his 1978 sports medicine book. After Merkin read my book, Ice, the Illusionary Treatment Option, he called me on the phone. He said, "You're going to like what I'm posting tomorrow." He posted, "I made this up. Research has clearly shown I was wrong. Don't do it. It delays healing." Gives a specific reference to the fact it causes additional damage, and then wrote the foreword to the Anti-Iceman's book, which is me. So I got the guy who made up the most recognized protocol in Western medicine to recant and write the foreword to the book that took down his protocol. That's why you shouldn't do it.
All right. So for so long we have used ice. So tell me just a little bit more about the science, the behind why, other than it blocks the flow, because some people aren't going to take just that. So give me some more of the science behind it.
Well, science from two sides. Try to give me science that it has benefit, and you can't, by the way. There have been multiple system-wide reviews, all come back to the same conclusion. Although popular, no evidence whatsoever that it's beneficial. But here's what we know it does do. It delays healing. It increases swelling. It causes additional damage, and it shuts off the signals that alert you to harmful movement, and you need movement to solve the problem, and you need the signals to prevent you from doing harmful movement. So it's the exact wrong thing to do. I'm often asked, what would be worse, sitting there and beating the air with a ball-peen hammer while you're making it cold? I don't know how to make it any worse. It's so wrong that you can't even come up with a good reason to do it if you're honest. And the fact is that when you do a literature review, which have been done multiple times, and all of that's documented on my website, on GaryReinhold.com. It's all free, so you can go and get it. I wrote an article recently, a rebuttal to someone that tried to suggest that what I was saying wasn't exactly correct. Read my rebuttal. It's called The Cold Hard Facts Weighing the Evidence. It's on my website. It's free. You read that and you go, well, this is just crazy. Who would do this? Who would deliberately trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies, which leads to additional damage and more swelling? Why would you do that? Well, because rice is nice. It rhymed. And I honestly believe if it hadn't rhymed, it would have never caught on. But it rhymed, and it stuck. But I presented the evidence, and the doctor who made it up recanted and wrote the foreword to my book.
So, Gary, let's talk about the importance of inflammation, actually. So I know in the Cold Hard Facts, I was reading over it a little bit this morning, you mentioned about the difference between inflammation and swelling. So let's talk about, the importance of inflammation in the healing process, and then the difference between inflammation and swelling as well. Okay,
well, the first question is very simple. There are 3 steps to healing: inflammation, repair, and remodel. It's not maybe, that's a fact. So why would you want to disrupt phase 1 of a 3-phase healing process? And when you look and you understand, it's not a mistake. And so, well, maybe there's too much inflammation. Well, how much too much? How'd you figure that out? How do you know there's too much? Maybe there's not enough. Are hands different than feet? Are you different than me? How would you know? What are you measuring it by? How do you know there's too much inflammation? And why on the warning labels to the anti-inflammatory drugs does it say, warning, if you take this drug, it's going to inhibit healing? Because everyone is aware of the fact that inflammation is phase 1 of 3 phases of healing who is in this business. Don't mess with it. It's right. It's not wrong. Now, could it ever go wrong? Sure. But in otherwise healthy people, especially young athletes, there is virtually no chance that their inflammatory response, their immune system, is going to be dysfunctional. It's going to work. And if it didn't work, how in the world would you know what wasn't working? How much off is it? How much too much is it? Maybe it's not enough. You have no mechanism to measure whatsoever. Why would you begin any process like that assuming it's wrong? Well, there is no good reason for that. You can't justify that. You know it's wrong. As soon as you think about it, you know it's wrong. And then you say, but I don't want too much inflammation. Well, okay. I get crazy on this. Just stop that you don't want too much inflammation. You can count on a healthy immune system responding well. If it doesn't, then make adjustments. Don't make adjustments before you start to even know what's going on. Now, the biggest problem is that nearly everyone that I spoke to in my early years of interviewing, and I interviewed hundreds of the most elite trainers, doctors, and therapists in the country, athletic trainers, from the pro teams to the Olympic Training Center to Apollo Ono's trainer. You named it. If you were famous and I could find your phone number, I went and saw you. Now, what happened is that nearly everybody confused the 2 words. They merged the words inflammation and swelling. They are not the same thing. Inflammation is phase 1 of a 3-phase healing process. That's the inflammatory response. Swelling is merely the end of the inflammatory cycle you have not yet evacuated. The swelling is something that happens automatically, by the way. Now, not the accumulation, but the fluid. If you remember in your textbook, it says that when there's damage, or when there's an injury or trauma, the damaged vessels constrict, convert ingredients in the blood to grow a clot, repair the damaged vessel, dissolve the clot, and normalize flow in 3 to 10 days or so. Comma. Not a period, not a paragraph. Comma. And the healthy surrounding vessels dilate and increase perfusion. That means the fluid is sent there on purpose. It's mobilizing repair and cleanup crew and packaging the waste for evacuation via your passive lymphatic system. So you go, oh, so the fluid's supposed to be there? Of course it's supposed to be there. If it wasn't supposed to be there, we'd all be dead. Okay? Of course it's supposed to be there. It's just not supposed to accumulate. And the reason it accumulates is because, drum roll please, of the Rice Protocol. Because rest, ice, and compression, Rick is wrong, traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. Get the problem? You should have walked it off the whole time. The coaches were right back in the late 50s when they told me. When I grew up back in the late 50s, and that's last century for all the millennials out there, okay, that's a long time ago, but no coach ever told me to sit still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around the damaged site. They said, walk it off. Don't sit still. It'll tighten up. Okay, so now we got this issue going. We realize that what the problem is that there is fluid accumulating. So let's think about how that fluid would evacuate. Let's look at the Rice Protocol. Would sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around the area, compressing the very vessels and depressing the entire system, would that move the waste through the passive lymphatic system? No. Now, what would move it through? Well, there's only one thing. It's called muscle activation, or loading the tissue. You activate the tissue in and around the damaged site. That compression, I call it milking the cow backwards. When you activate those muscles in and around the damaged site, it milks the cow backwards, and next thing you know, the waste is eliminated. So the swelling isn't a good or a bad thing. Stop that. Get that out of your mind. It's not a good or a bad thing. It is merely the accumulation of waste at the end of the inflammatory cycle you have not yet evacuated. Now, evacuate it.
So, go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Probably going to ask you the same question. So, we're talking about a lot of athletic trainers. We speak to a lot of clinicians who deal with these types of injuries or deal with all types of injuries. I think what we're probably going to have a problem with is that dissonance that once you start talking about the ice is bad, you're going to have a lot of people and you'll see it all over the place. You'll see people fight you back on it. You even stated that you face a lot of fierce skepticism, and you've done a really good job of explaining those things. I guess my question would be is how does ice delay the recovery? You said that the Rick part of the rice stops it. How can we better explain that, why ice stops that or delays the recovery?
It shuts off the signals between the muscles and the nerves and slows down the metabolic process. I mean, that's the reason it's done. It's a wrong reason, but it's the reason it's done. When you make things cold and you take it down to a lower level like that, you shut off the signals between the muscles and the nerves, which slows down the metabolic process. That was mistakenly understood or described by Knight. And I'm sorry that I have so many people that I have to take on, but again, you have this problem with this secondary cellular death stuff where they thought, the area is congested, and because of the congestion, cells are suffocating and dying, so what we'll do is we'll stop the movement. Okay, what? You have congestion, so your solution is to slow it down more? Well, Knight mistakenly called it secondary cellular death. It's not secondary. Secondary would be that it happens as a result of the primary. Well, that's not what happened here. It's not secondary. It's primary to the congestion. Eliminate the congestion, there'll be no secondary cellular death because it wasn't that in the first place. It's primary to the congestion. So you get the congestion out, now you don't have the problem anymore, and then nothing dies. So I have an article called Secondary Cellular Death is Actually Negligent Homicide. Again, that's free on my website. I explain everything. I have all the references, all the evidence-based medicine to prove what I just said. And so you got to get over the problems that people have in their minds of, this is what I've done and this is how I've solved it. Stop it. It's wrong. Rick is wrong. Rest, ice, and compression traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. That's it. It's a fact. You can't change it. There's no editing needed for that. It's simply a fact. So now what do we do? Well, over 1 million people have heard my message. I can tell you that my argument is strong enough that people like Apollo Ono's trainer no longer ice. Many of the people that I know in the military no longer ice. Many of the Major League Baseball teams no longer ice. Very few, and almost to a point of almost none of the athletes, Major League pitchers that I'm involved with through the trainers, which would be well over 200 Major League pitchers. That's not a hype, by the way. That's me sending an email to all the head trainers and saying, could you give me a count? I'm trying to help everybody understand how many people are doing this now. That's the head trainers sending back to me with 100% response, by the way. All 30 teams responded. And I have an accurate count of over 200 Major League pitchers now using my muscle activation technique, the Mark Pro, and not doing the old icing idea. And if you listen to an interview I did with Corey Kluber a couple years ago, Corey, who won the Cy that year, it was his second Cy Young Award, been using my product for the past 5 years, not icing. Corey said, I don't ice, makes my arm feel stiff, don't like how it feels. I use the Mark Pro. My arm feels the best it felt my whole career, and if you have a chance to use this and you don't, you're making a mistake. Okay, next question, please. I went to the most complicated group of athletes that I could find, Major League pitchers, took them from a state of sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around their shoulder and converted the leg. I'm going to guess with my rough number right now, and I'm so close it won't make a difference. So, yes, it's a guess, but I'm very close. Half the Major League teams don't ice their pitchers anymore. And you go, you shifted. Yes, I shifted it. I shifted it by simply pointing out the facts. I asked him, what are you trying to do? Well, we want to get his arm, but no, what are you trying to do? Well, no, forget about your 5-day rotation. What are you trying to do? When there is tissue damage, what is your job? What is your goal? Okay, the goal is to preserve and regenerate lost tissue. So you want to preserve. You don't want to lose any more than you've already lost. So you want to make sure that you get rid of the congestion, you normalize flow. You don't want to lose any more through that, quote, secondary cellular death, which I defined as negligent homicide. So you don't want to lose any more, and you want to regenerate that which has been lost. Okay, how do you do that? A, you've got to decongest the area. B, you've got to recapitalize the area around the damaged site. So let's just look at each one separately. You want to decongest the area. How does waste move through the passive lymphatic system? By sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around it? Answer, no. So if we had a buzzard here, it would have gone off, no. They cannot move waste through a passive system by sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around it. So that won't work. How do you recapitalize the area around the damaged site? How do you cause angiogenesis? By sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around the area? Again, being no. How do you do it? By loading the tissue. There's no other way to increase the capillarity around the damaged site except by sprouting angiogenesis, except with some drugs that can do it, but that's kind of creepy and it's not really what we do in sports. But there are a couple drugs they're trying to do that with, but it wouldn't be for this purpose. So you've got to decongest the area and recapitalize the area around the damaged site. Simultaneously, you'd want a goal of preventing disuse atrophy. So while you're recovering, while you're decongesting the area, while you're recapitalizing the area around the damaged site, you wouldn't want to have disuse atrophy. So how does disuse atrophy work? Well, when you disuse, you atrophy. So guess what happens when you activate the muscles in and around the damaged site to decongest the area and recapitalize the tissue around that site? That same stress, that same loading causes the muscle to produce and release what's called PGC alpha 1. The PGC alpha 1 prevents disuse atrophy. My point then, next question.
All right, so I do have a question there. So we're talking about kind of what this looks like in the athletic training room. So one of the things that we've typically done is move away from ice here at Pasadena High School. And one of the things that I kind of still do is I'll use an ice bucket, but I'll have them moving their ankle inside of that. So we're moving it, and we're creating that, they're not passive, they're not sitting still, and then we follow that up with rehab exercises. And so talk to me a little bit more about why I should not use, I know we talked about the ice, but is the ice bucket the same? And if I'm moving it while icing it, is it still creating the same problem?
No, it's not as bad. So it wouldn't be as bad as sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around it. but you're making it cold, so you're slowing down the metabolic process. You're causing the vessels to constrict. You're shutting off the signals between the muscles and the nerves. It will desensitize the sensation of pain, but you don't want to desensitize the sensation of pain if you're trying to move, because those signals that alert you to harmful movement, they're telling you not to do what you're doing. So you wouldn't want to do it to desensitize the sensation of pain, so that would not be a good plan. And since you're moving it to try to increase circulation, well, the cold's decreasing your circulation. So why not just do active ankle pumps? Because, by the way, before everyone got into this ice craze, that's what everyone did. They walked it off, or they did ankle pumps, or they squeezed their hand, but they squeezed the ball, or they did active things where they loaded the tissue. This idea of icing was just a mistake. It was an error. It rhymed. If it didn't rhyme, I'm telling you truthfully, I don't believe it would have ever become popular. Rice is not nice. It's wrong. So now we go, but I've used the bucket of ice with the guys moving their foot, and it seems to help. I get it. I understand that.
Another acronym that's just as nice as rice that you like to use?
Well, I made up a thing called ARETA. Active recovery is the answer. And the reason I made up ARETA, because I was on the phone speaking to a reporter writing an article about me for the Toronto Star. And she said to me, well, if rice is wrong, what's right? And I said, hold on a second. And I went, active recovery is the answer. I said, ARETA. And she said, what's ARETA? I said, active recovery is the answer. She said, you've been saying that the whole interview. I said, I know, but I never wrote the acronym before. So now we got it. It's ARETA. Active recovery is the answer. Look, the fact is, walking it off has always been right. That's what we did through all time. From the beginning of time, we walked it off. We always moved. That's how the system's designed to self-repair. This is one of the biggest problems that I have when I'm trying to talk to people who don't want to hear this information. They fight the fact that the human body is designed to self-repair, not self-destruct. If it's self-destructing, figure out why and make a change. Well, how does it self-repair? It self-repairs by decongesting the area and recapitalizing the tissue around the damaged site. That's how it self-repairs. So anything that isn't doing that, look for a different thing. And so you stop and say, let's just look at the RICE protocol, rest, ice, compression, elevation. Does that decongest the area and recapitalize the tissue around the damaged site? The answer is no. So don't do that. So what should you do? Well, walking it off was pretty smart. But the problem with walking it off is sometimes that stresses the damaged site beyond its what's a reasonable level. In other words, my rule is that if it elevates your level of discomfort, then you need to find a different thing, do it a different way. So don't make it hurt. Use your brain, never cause pain is another way that I say it. And you want to get activation in and around the damaged site. That's the only way you can move the waste to the passive lymphatic system. And that's what you're trying to do. It just so happens that that same loading or stressing actually causes the tissue the vessels to recapitalize around the damaged site, which also prevents the tissue's atrophy. And then if I go in a little bit of a parenthesis right here where I'm not positive about this, although I am writing the article at this time, and I'm really close to being sure, you know what myostatin is. Myostatin is what prevents the body from growing too much muscle. And if you remember the boy Hercules from a few years ago in the newspaper, what had happened was he didn't have the myostatin to prevent his muscles from growing, so he became very, very muscular. And if you Google boy Hercules myostatin, you'll pop up the whole articles there. You can go on the internet and read all about myostatin. But what myostatin does is myostatin blocks muscle regeneration. So if you go over in the bodybuilding world, all the bodybuilding guys who are very serious and women who are very serious take something called MyoX or one of those products to block the myostatin. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, because if you block the myostatin, your muscles grow more. And when your myostatin levels are high, well, that blocks muscle regeneration. So guess what sitting still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around your damaged site does? The inactivity elevates your myostatin levels, which basically ensures that you will not be able to regrow your muscles. And so if you activate your muscles, that loading, that stress on the muscles, the aerobic activity, actually elevates your